The sun rose lazily over the verdant pastures of Pine Ridge, Montana, spreading golden rays that danced between the barbed wire fences of Victory Ranch. Frank Thompson, a 62-year-old man with weather-beaten skin and eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets, walked with firm steps toward the main corral. His leather boots rhythmically struck the packed earth, while the aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the characteristic smell of ground moistened by the morning dew. He stopped before the fence and rested his thick arms on the weathered wood. His half-closed eyes fixed on the animal that dominated the center of the arena, like a king on his throne. Lightning. The name echoed in his mind like an ancient prayer, laden with reverence and fear. The horse was an impressive sight. Mixed thoroughbred chestnut coat that gleamed under the morning light, defined muscles that contracted with each movement, like stretched cords ready to explode. "Good morning, my old warrior," muttered Frank, more to himself than to the animal. Lightning raised his proud head and stared at him for a moment, as if understanding every word. It was a look that reminded Frank why that horse had become a living legend throughout the Bear Valley region. Pete, the ranch foreman, approached carrying a steaming mug of black coffee. He was a thin man, with a graying mustache and respectful manner who had earned Frank's trust over 20 years of hard work and unwavering loyalty. "Boss, you're thoughtful this early morning," said Pete, extending the mug. "Something worrying you?" Frank accepted the coffee and took a long sip, savoring the strong bitterness that fully awakened him. "It's not worry, Pete. It's ambition." His eyes returned to Lightning. "For 12 years this horse has been here with me, 12 years watching. Man after man trying to tame him and failing. Do you know how many managed to stay mounted for more than 5 seconds? None, boss. Not a single one." "Exactly." Frank smiled, but there was something fierce in that smile. "And do you know why? That makes me proud." Pete shook his head, waiting for the answer he knew would come loaded with meaning. "Because Lightning doesn't just represent a horse, Pete. He represents what's purest in struggle, the strength that doesn't bend, the spirit that doesn't break. And today, my friend, I'm going to make an announcement that will put our ranch on the map across the entire country." The foreman widened his eyes, sensing that something big was coming. Frank finished his coffee in one gulp and handed the empty mug back. "We're going to organize the biggest riding tournament this state has ever seen. It won't be a simple rodeo. It'll be a national challenge. I'm offering $50,000 to whoever can ride Lightning for a full 8 seconds. Pete almost dropped the mug. $50,000, boss? Are you sure that'll attract cowboys from all over the country? That's exactly what I want, replied Frank, with an ambitious gleam in his eyes. I want them to come from Texas, from Colorado, from Kentucky, from wherever necessary. I want everyone to see that impossible challenges still exist in this world. And when they all fail, when the last man is thrown to the ground, Lightning will continue being what he's always been, unbeatable. The horse, as if having heard the conversation, neighed loudly and reared on his hind legs, displaying all his strength and majesty. It was a spectacle that never failed to impress. But boss, hesitated Pete, what if someone actually succeeds? What if a cowboy good enough appears to— No one will appear, Frank cut him off categorical. Trust me, Pete, I know this horse like nobody else. I know every movement, every reaction. Lightning has a soul that doesn't let itself be dominated, and that's what we're going to prove to the entire country. Inside the main house, through the kitchen window, Martha observed her husband talking with the foreman. She was a 58-year-old woman, gray hair tied in a simple bun, hands calloused from so much housework. She had known Frank for 40 years and knew how to recognize when he was planning something risky. That man's going to end up in trouble, she muttered to herself, stirring sugar into her coffee with nervous movements. Always been too stubborn for his own good. Outside, Frank was already drawing up detailed plans. He talked about hiring a professional sound company, setting up temporary bleachers, hiring security and paramedics. His voice gained animation with each detail, as if he were reliving his youth. Pete, I want you to spread the word. Tell the other foremen at neighboring ranches, call that journalist from the country program on the radio, make noise. In 1 week, I want everyone in the state talking about the Lightning Challenge. The foreman nodded, still a bit stunned by the magnitude of his boss's plans. And When will the tournament be, boss? 3 weeks from now. That's enough time for preparations and for the news to spread. Frank looked once more at Lightning, who was now grazing peacefully, oblivious to the excitement his fame was about to cause. It's going to be glorious, Pete. It's going to be the event this region will never forget. As the two men moved away from the corral, discussing organizational details, the horse raised his head and looked toward the dirt road leading to town. As if sensing that great changes were coming, he shook his mane in the wind and let out a neigh that echoed throughout the ranch, announcing new times approaching with the force of a storm. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. The news spread like wildfire. In less than 48 hours, Big Sky Radio talked of nothing else. The Country Soul program, hosted by Tommy Brooks, dedicated an entire hour to the subject, interviewing Frank by telephone and broadcasting recorded neighs from Lightning, as if they were an epic soundtrack. "My people of Bear Valley and surroundings," Tommy said with his theatrical voice, "you're hearing on Big Sky Radio the opportunity of a lifetime, $50,000 for whoever can ride the famous Lightning of Victory Ranch. But listen closely. This isn't just any horse. This is the animal that has thrown more than 100 men in the last 12 years. Martha sighed while peeling potatoes in the kitchen. With each mention of Lightning's name on the radio, she felt a tightness in her chest that she couldn't explain. There was something about that horse that deeply troubled her, a memory that stubbornly remained buried in some dark corner of her mind. "Frank," she called when her husband came in for lunch, "are you sure this is a good idea?" "That horse, he's not like the others, you know that." Frank sat at the solid wooden table that dominated the rustic kitchen. His large calloused hands drummed nervously on the surface polished by time. "Martha, woman, don't start with those superstitions. Lightning is a horse, an extraordinary horse, but still a horse. Superstitions." Martha stopped stirring the beans and faced her husband. "Frank, have you forgotten what happened 5 years ago? That boy, what was his name again?" The fork stopped in midair, halfway to Frank's mouth. For an instant, his face hardened, and he looked away toward the window. "Jason Walker," he murmured almost inaudibly. "Jason Walker," repeated Martha, lowering her voice. "A 17-year-old boy, full of life, who came here thinking he could prove something. And after that day—" "Enough, Martha." Frank's voice came out harsher than he intended. "It was an accident. Accidents happen at rodeos. They always have. The boy knew the risks." But Martha knew her husband too well not to notice the almost imperceptible tremor in his voice. She knew that no matter how much he tried to hide it, that day still haunted him. There were nights when she heard him turning in bed, murmuring Jason Walker's name among nightmares he couldn't push away. That afternoon, while Frank was in town organizing the tournament details, Martha walked to Lightning's corral. The animal was lying in the shade of a leafy tree but raised his head when he noticed her approaching. "What are you hiding, old fellow?" she asked quietly, as if the horse could answer. "Why do you react differently with some people?" Lightning rose slowly and walked to the fence. For a moment, his large dark eyes seemed to reflect an almost human intelligence. Martha extended her hesitant hand, and to her surprise, the horse didn't back away. He allowed her to touch his forehead, something he rarely did with strangers. "You remember him, don't you?" she whispered. "You remember Jason Walker?" In town, the excitement grew exponentially. Hank's hardware store couldn't meet the demand for wooden nails for the temporary bleachers. The town's hotel, with only 12 rooms, was already booked solid. Pickup trucks with out-of-state plates began appearing on the streets, transporting eager cowboys and their equipment. At Joe's Bar, the traditional meeting point for men in the region, conversations revolved exclusively around the tournament. Stories about Lightning were told and retold, each version more exaggerated than the previous. "I saw with my own eyes," said Clint, a retired cowboy, "the horse throwing a man 15 yards away. 15 yards, you heard right." "That's an exaggeration, Clint," countered Mr. Thompson, the pharmacy owner. "But I admit I've never seen anything like it. That animal has supernatural strength." "Supernatural is the right word," agreed Bobby, the local barber. "My wife always says there's something Strange about that horse, says he has a heavy soul. The conversation was interrupted by the entrance of a young woman few immediately recognized. Emily Walker pushed her wheelchair with precise, determined movements. She was 17, with brown hair tied in a simple ponytail and eyes that carried an unusual seriousness for her age. "Excuse me," she said, heading to the counter where Joe was drying glasses with a checkered cloth. "Are you talking about the tournament at Victory Ranch?" The men turned, some with curiosity, others with poorly disguised condescension. Joe nodded respectfully. "We sure are, miss. It's the talk of the entire town. Do you know someone who's participating?" Emily smiled, but there was something enigmatic in that smile. "Maybe," she answered simply. "I heard it's a very special horse." "Special is an understatement," intervened Clint. "That beast is a living legend. It's injured more people than any animal I know." "Injured?" repeated Emily, and for an instant her voice carried a melancholic note that went unnoticed by most present. "And do you think he does it out of malice?" "Does it matter?" asked Bobby. "A wild animal is a wild animal, young lady. There's no explanation." Emily remained silent for a few seconds, absorbing the words. Then, with the same gentleness with which she had arrived, she began heading toward the exit. "Thank you for the information," she said. "Perhaps we'll see each other at the tournament." After she left, the men exchanged intrigued looks. "Strange girl," commented Mr. Thompson. "She talked as if she knew the horse." "Did you see her eyes?" asked Joe thoughtfully. "They had something I can't explain, as if she were keeping a secret." Outside, Emily pushed her wheelchair down the main street of Pine Ridge, lost in thoughts that took her back to the past. A past that would soon come to light, transforming that tournament into much more than a simple riding competition. A week had passed since the tournament announcement, and Victory Ranch was unrecognizable. Trucks unloaded construction materials incessantly, workers erected temporary bleachers, and the field that before served only for cattle grazing now housed a professional arena with all the safety specifications required by the Rodeo Federation. Frank supervised every detail with the rigor of a general preparing for battle. His boots walked back and forth, checking the height of the fences, testing the strength of the gates, inspecting the sound system that had just arrived from Billings. "Pete!" he shouted to the foreman who was organizing a pile of safety mats. "Those mats need to cover the entire side of the arena. I don't want any uncovered space. If someone falls, I want them to fall soft." "Yes, boss, but do we need so much protection?" "The cowboys know the risk," replied Pete, wiping sweat from his forehead with his shirt cuff. Frank stopped and became thoughtful for a moment. The image of Jason Walker returned to his mind like a persistent shadow. "Knowing the risk is one thing, Pete. Minimizing the consequences is our responsibility." That morning, a white tent was set up near the main entrance of the ranch. It was there that the registration desk for competitors would function. Pete was designated to receive the cowboys, verify documents, and collect registration fees. The movement was constant. Men of all ages arrived, some alone, others accompanied by entire families who came to celebrate. Around 10 o'clock, when the sun was already strong and Pete was attending the 15th registrant of the day, a shadow projected over the table. He looked up and saw a young woman in a wheelchair, wearing faded jeans, a white cotton shirt, and a cap that protected her eyes from the intense sun. "Good morning," said Emily with a firm voice. "I'd like to register for the lightning challenge." Pete blinked several times, thinking he had heard wrong. "Come again, miss." "I want to register for the competition," repeated Emily, without showing any hesitation. "To ride lightning." A murmur of incredulity spread among the cowboys waiting in line. Some laughed openly, others shook their heads in disbelief. A tall, bearded man, who had introduced himself as Tony from Wyoming, approached the table. "Miss, you know this ain't no game, right?" he said with a condescending voice. "This horse has broken ribs of men much stronger than you." Emily turned to face him, and there was a firmness in her eyes that made the man step back. "I know exactly what I'm doing. Thank you for your concern." Pete scratched his head, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Miss, Well, I don't know if I can accept your registration. I mean, you're underage and I'm in a wheelchair, completed Emily without bitterness in her voice. Is that what you're trying to say? The foreman swallowed hard. It's not prejudice, miss. It's just... Well, we've never had a situation like this. I don't even... I know if it's allowed. Emily opened a small bag that was hanging on the side of her wheelchair and took out a plastic-covered envelope. Here's a judicial authorization that allows me to participate in any sporting competition as a citizen with full civil rights. It's signed by the judge of Pine Ridge County. The document passed from hand to hand among the curious who had gathered around the table. Everything was in order. Official stamp, recognized signature, recent date. But how are you going to ride the horse, girl? Asked a woman who was accompanying her registered husband. I don't mean any offense, but the same way as any other. Competitor, Emily answered simply. With determination. At that moment, Frank appeared at the tent, attracted by the commotion. When he saw the scene, his eyes narrowed. There was something familiar about that young woman, something that awakened an uncomfortable memory he couldn't identify. What's happening here? He asked with authority. Pete stood up respectfully. Boss, this young lady wants to register for the competition. She even has judicial authorization, but I don't know if... Frank studied Emily intensely. There was something in her face, in the way she faced him without intimidation, that made him feel uneasy. What's your name, miss? Emily Walker. The surname echoed in Frank's mind like a distant bell. Walker. Where had he heard that name before, and why did he feel a tightness in his chest upon hearing that young woman pronounce it? Where are you from, Emily Walker? From around here, born and raised in Pine Ridge. And why do you want to participate in this competition? Are you aware of the danger it represents? Emily remained silent for a few seconds, as if carefully choosing her words. I have my reasons, Mr. Thompson, personal reasons. There was a subtle pain in her voice that didn't go unnoticed by Frank. It was the kind of pain he knew well, as he had carried a similar one in his chest for 5 years. Pete, he said finally, accept her registration. If everything's legal, we've got nothing to do about it. But boss, you heard what I said. Frank's voice was final. Register her name. Emily Walker, competitor number... He looked at the list. Number 23. Emily nodded respectfully. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. When she moved away, pushing her wheelchair toward the arena where lightning was being fed, Frank couldn't take his eyes off her. There was something in her movements, in her determined posture, that reminded him of Jason Walker, he whispered to himself, and felt a chill run down his spine. Pete, who heard the murmur, approached. What is it, boss? Nothing, Frank replied quickly. Just remembered something. Continue with the registrations. But for the rest of the day, while supervising the final preparations, Frank couldn't concentrate completely. His mind constantly returned to Emily Walker, and to the disturbing feeling that that young woman was there for reasons much deeper than the simple pursuit of prize money. And when the sun set over Victory Ranch, painting the sky in orange hues, he became certain that the tournament he had envisioned as a celebration of power and dominance was about to transform into something completely different, something that could open wounds he had tried to keep closed for 5 long years. The first day of the tournament dawned with a clear sky and a sun that promised intense heat. At 6 in the morning, Victory Ranch was already buzzing with activity. Entire families arrived in pickup trucks loaded with coolers and beach chairs, while street vendors set up stalls offering barbecue, fried pastries, and cold lemonade. The bleachers, with capacity for 500 people, quickly filled up. The sound system tested by Frank echoed throughout the property, announcing the local sponsors and creating a festive atmosphere that infected even the most skeptical. "People of Victory Ranch," shouted Mark, the announcer specially hired for the event, "prepare yourselves to witness the greatest riding challenge in Montana history. $50,000 await the brave soul who can tame the legendary Lightning." Emily arrived early, pushing her wheelchair through groups of people who observed her with poorly disguised curiosity. She positioned herself strategically near the arena, from where she could observe every movement of Lightning and study his behavior patterns. The horse was in the special enclosure built next to the main arena, separated from the other animals. That would be used in the preliminary competitions. Even from a distance, it was possible to feel his imposing presence. Lightning walked from side to side, with movements that demonstrated his contained strength, like a storm about to explode. "Ladies and gentlemen," continued Mark through the microphone, "before the big challenge, we'll have some smaller competitions to warm things up. Let's start with the beginners category." The first competitors performed riding more docile horses, but even so provided an interesting spectacle. The crowd applauded each successful ride and groaned in compassion with each more violent fall. Emily observed everything with redoubled attention, but her eyes always returned to Lightning. It was as if there existed an invisible connection between them, a conducting wire that she still didn't completely understand. Around 2 in the afternoon, when the sun was at its peak and the heat made the air heavy like melted lead, the moment everyone was waiting for arrived. Mark adjusted the microphone and his voice gained a solemn tone. "My friends, it's time for the Lightning Challenge. Our first brave competitor is Sebastian Silva from Cheyenne, with 15 years of rodeo experience." Sebastian was a robust man, about 40, with muscular arms and a confident look that showed he had faced many wild horses throughout his career. He greeted the audience with a wave and walked toward the chute where Lightning waited. The horse noticed the approach and immediately became agitated. His muscles contracted, nostrils dilated, and he began to beat his hooves against the wooden floor with increasing force. "Careful, Sebastian!" someone shouted from the bleachers. "That beast is nervous." Sebastian mounted with the experience of someone who had done that thousands of times. For a moment there was absolute silence in the arena. Then the gate opened. Lightning exploded out of the chute like a rocket. These weren't the predictable movements of a common horse trying to throw its rider. They were calculated jumps, precise spins, a choreography of fury that demonstrated frightening intelligence. Sebastian lasted 4 seconds before being launched into the air like a rag doll. He landed heavily on the protective mats, rolled twice and remained still for a few moments, dazed. 4 seconds, announced Mark. "Sebastian Silva, 4 seconds. Very good, but still far from the necessary 8. The competitor rose slowly, shook the dust from his clothes and waved to the crowd, which applauded him respectfully. But in his eyes there was an expression of incredulity that Emily didn't fail to notice. The second competitor was Ronald Parker from Idaho. He lasted just 2 seconds. The third, a young man in his early 20s named Wally, managed 3 seconds before being thrown with such force that he needed medical attention. And so it went throughout the afternoon. Competitor after competitor climbed into the chute, full of confidence, and left the arena with injured pride and aching body. Lightning seemed to never tire. With each new ride, he demonstrated the same explosive energy, the same fierce determination to rid himself of any weight on his back. "That horse ain't normal," muttered Mrs. Wilson, wife of one of the competitors, to her neighbor in the bleachers. "There's something supernatural about him." "I agree," replied the neighbor, waving a paper fan to cool herself. "Never seen anything like it. It's as if he knows exactly what he's doing." Emily, who heard the conversation, smiled discreetly. They were right. Lightning wasn't a common horse. There was in him an intelligence and a memory that few could perceive, and she was beginning to understand that her presence there might awaken in him memories that had long remained dormant. When the 15th competitor was thrown, Frank approached the waiting area for participants. His face showed a mixture of pride and concern. Pride because Lightning was proving to be exactly what he always knew he was, unbeatable. Concern because he was beginning to wonder if he hadn't underestimated the psychological impact that so many consecutive falls could have on the remaining competitors. "Folks," he said, addressing the cowboys still waiting their turn, "whoever wants to quit can do so without problem. The registration money will be refunded. Nobody here is going to judge you for it." Some men exchanged glances, clearly tempted by the offer, but most remained firm, driven by the explosive combination of male pride and greed for the prize. Emily observed the entire scene without saying a word. When Frank passed by her, their gazes met for an instant. There was something in his expression that she recognized. It was the same concern she saw in her aunt's eyes when they talked about the past. The sun was beginning to lean westward when Mark announced the last competitor of the day. "Ladies and gentlemen, our 21st competitor is Jack Santos from Bozeman, 23 years old and more than 100 rides on his resume." Jack was a thin young man, but with defined muscles and a determined look that impressed even the most skeptical. He walked toward the chute with firm steps, greeted Lightning with a respectful pat on the neck, and mounted with smooth movements. This time, when the gate opened, something different happened. Lightning came out with less fury, as if he were studying his new adversary. Jack managed to stay balanced for 5 seconds, 6 and 7. The crowd held their breath. Emily stood up from her wheelchair, supporting herself on her arms to see better. 8 seconds. The bell rang, indicating that the time had been completed, but Jack couldn't dismount. Lightning gave one last violent jump and the young man went to the ground unconscious. The silence that followed was sepulchral. Jack had achieved the 8 seconds, but at what price? The paramedics ran to the arena while Frank remained motionless, his face as pale as paper. Emily looked at Lightning, who now stood in the center of the arena, panting, as if he too had realized that something had changed in that moment. And for the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, she felt a pang of fear pierce her heart. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. The dawn that followed the first day of the tournament was restless for many at Victory Ranch. Jack Santos had been taken to the Pine Ridge Hospital with suspected concussion, and although doctors had confirmed he was out of danger, the image of his inert body in the arena continued to haunt the thoughts of all who witnessed the scene. Frank couldn't sleep. He walked around the house all night, frequently stopping at the window that overlooked the arena, where Lightning remained in the special enclosure, motionless like a bronze statue under the full moon's light. "You're not going to rest until you resolve this, are you?" said Martha, appearing at the living room door wearing a faded cotton robe. Frank turned to his wife, and she could see the weight of years and worries marked in every line of his tired face. "How can I rest, Martha? That boy almost happened again." "Almost what happened again, Frank?" she asked, approaching and placing a loving hand on his shoulder. "You never really told me what happened with Jason Walker." Frank sighed deeply and let himself fall into the leather armchair he had occupied for more than 20 years. "I don't like talking about that. I prefer to leave the past buried." "But the past never really stays buried, my love. It always comes back somehow." Martha sat on the arm of the chair. "And now we have this girl, Emily, who's going to participate tomorrow. Did you see how she looks at Lightning? There's something there that's not normal." Outside, without the couple knowing, Emily had arrived at the ranch before dawn. She pushed her wheelchair silently along the dirt paths, heading to the enclosure where Lightning rested. The moon was still high, providing enough light for her to see the animal clearly. "Hi, old fellow," murmured Emily when she got close to the fence. "Do you remember me?" Lightning slowly raised his head and stared at her. For a long moment, horse and young woman remained in silence, as if they were having a conversation that dispensed with words. "You remember that day, don't you?" continued Emily, her voice carrying a deep sadness. 5 years ago, you remember Jason Walker." The horse took a few steps toward the fence, his large, dark eyes fixed on Emily's. There was in them an expression she recognized. It was guilt. Guilt and regret. "He was my cousin," said Emily, and for the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, she allowed tears to roll down her face. "My younger cousin, full of dreams, full of life. He came here to prove he was man enough to tame you, and after that day—" Lightning came closer and, to Emily's surprise, extended his muzzle to touch her hand. It was a delicate gesture, almost human in its tenderness. "I was here that day," she continued, gently caressing the animal's muzzle. "I saw everything happen. I saw when you threw him to the ground. I saw when he didn't get up anymore. I saw when the doctors said he would never walk again." Emily's voice trembled with the emotion of the memory. "But I also saw something that no one else saw. I saw you after they took Jason Walker away. I saw you walking in circles in the arena looking for him. I saw you cry, Lightning. Yes, you cried. Horses cried too. And I saw it." Lightning lowered his head, as if understanding every word. Emily continued caressing him, feeling under her fingers the powerful muscles that made her cousin a person with permanent disability. "For years I hated you," she confessed. "I hated you. I hated this ranch. I hated Mr. Thompson for allowing that to happen. But with time I began to understand that you're not just a wild animal. You have feelings, have memory, have regret." At that moment, Emily heard footsteps approaching. She turned and saw Frank walking toward the enclosure, carrying a steaming coffee mug. "You arrived early," he said, stopping a few meters away. "Couldn't sleep," replied Emily, quickly wiping away her tears. "Wanted to spend some time with him before the competition." Frank studied the scene before him. The young woman in a wheelchair lovingly caressing the horse that had broken dozens of men. It was an image that defied all logic he knew about animal behavior. "Emily," he said softly, "can I ask you something? Why are you really here?" She turned to face him, and Frank saw in her eyes a determination that reminded him of someone. "Do you remember Jason Walker?" The name hit Frank like a punch to the stomach. The coffee mug slipped from his hands and shattered on the ground. "Jason Walker," he murmured. "You're his cousin," completed Emily. "Cousin, best friend, and the only person who was with him in the hospital during the 6 months he struggled to accept his new condition." Frank staggered and leaned on the fence. The pieces of the puzzle finally fit in his mind. The familiarity of Emily's face, the determination in her eyes, the way Lightning reacted to her presence. "My God," he whispered, "why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't come here seeking revenge or to blame anyone," replied Emily firmly. "I came here seeking peace. For me, for Jason, and mainly for Lightning." The horse, as if having understood he was being mentioned, came even closer to the fence and rested his head on Emily's shoulder. It was a gesture of absolute trust that left Frank speechless. "Emily," he said with a choked voice, "you can't participate in the competition. It's too dangerous, after what happened yesterday with Jack." "That's exactly why I need to participate," she interrupted. "Don't you understand? Lightning isn't a ferocious animal. He's a wounded animal, wounded by guilt, by regret, by the thin possibility of asking forgiveness. And as long as he carries that weight, he'll continue hurting people." Frank looked alternately at Emily and Lightning, beginning to understand something that was beyond his experience as a rancher. He was facing a connection that transcended the normal laws of nature, a bond forged by shared pain and the need for healing. "And you believe you can heal him?" he asked. Emily smiled, and for the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, there was genuine hope in her expression. "I don't know if I can heal him, but I know I can try, and sometimes trying is the first step to achieving the impossible." The sun was beginning to rise on the horizon, tinting the sky with pinkish and golden hues. It was the second day of the tournament, and Emily knew her time was coming. But now, with the truth finally revealed, she felt she was ready to face not only Lightning, but also the ghosts of the past that haunted all of them. The second day of the tournament dawned with a completely different atmosphere from the previous one. News about Jack Santos's accident had spread, and many of the remaining competitors arrived at the ranch with tense expressions and hesitant movements. Some cancelled their participations during the night, citing urgent commitments or sudden health problems. Frank spent the first hours of the morning trying to process everything he had discovered about Emily. He walked around the house like a man in a trance, frequently stopping to look out the window toward the enclosure, where she continued talking to Lightning in a low voice. "Frank," said Martha, serving breakfast at the kitchen table, "you need to eat something. You're as pale as a sheet." "How can I eat, Martha?" he replied, sitting heavily in the chair. "That girl, she's Jason Walker's cousin, and she's going to try to ride Lightning today." Martha stopped stirring the eggs in the skillet and turned to face him. "Jason Walker's cousin? But how? Why didn't she say anything before?" "Said she didn't come seeking revenge," muttered Frank, running his hands through his graying hair. "Said she came seeking peace, but how am I going to live with myself if what happened to the boy happens to her?" Outside, Emily had spent the entire morning with Lightning. She talked to him as if he were an old friend, telling stories about Jason, remembering the times when the two cousins played together on the family's rural property. The horse seemed to absorb every word, remaining calm and attentive in a way that drastically contrasted with his behavior of previous days. Around 10 o'clock, Pete approached the enclosure carrying a special saddle he had commissioned during the night. "Miss Emily," he said respectfully, "the boss asked me to adapt this saddle for you. It has extra straps and supports that will help with your safety." Emily examined the saddle carefully. It was an impeccable piece of craftsmanship, with soft leather and gleaming hardware. "Mr. Thompson had this made for me." "Yes, he did. Spent all night on the phone calling saddlers from Billings until he found someone who would do the job on short notice." Pete lowered his voice. "He's very worried about you, miss." "I know," said Emily, touching the saddle with admiration, "and I appreciate the concern, but it won't be necessary." Pete frowned. "What do you mean it won't be necessary?" Emily smiled and pointed to Lightning, who was peacefully chewing grass a few meters away. "Because I'm not going to use a saddle." The foreman widened his eyes. "Miss, have you lost your mind? Riding that horse without a saddle is practically asking for—" "It's asking for trust," interrupted Emily softly. "And trust isn't built with straps and supports, Pete. It's built with truth." At 2 in the afternoon, when the sun was at its peak and the crowd had settled in the bleachers, Mark took the microphone to announce the continuation of the competitions. There were only 5 competitors remaining, including Emily. "People of Victory Ranch," said the announcer, his voice echoing across the property, "let's continue our Lightning Challenge. Our next competitor is Vincent Costa from Sheridan." Vincent was an experienced man, over 50, and with a solid reputation in regional rodeos, but even he, upon seeing Lightning being prepared in the chute, showed visible signs of nervousness. The ride lasted only 3 seconds. Lightning launched him with a force that made the crowd swallow hard. Vincent rose staggering, waved to the audience, and left the arena shaking his head negatively. The next competitor quit on the spot. He simply looked at the horse, shook his head, and announced he wouldn't participate. "All right, folks," shouted Mark, trying to maintain the crowd's enthusiasm. "Next competitor is Robert Silver from Helena." Robert lasted 4 seconds, but it was such a violent fall that he needed help to leave the arena. Only 2 competitors remained, a nervous young man from Great Falls who clearly regretted having registered, and Emily. The young man from Great Falls was called, but when he got close to the chute and saw Lightning snorting and stomping his hooves, his courage completely disappeared. "I quit," he said to Mark. "I don't want to end up in the hospital." A murmur of disappointment ran through the crowd. Mark looked at his list and announced with an uncertain voice, "Well, folks, looks like we have just one more competitor, Emily Walker." The silence that followed was absolute. 500 people held their breath as they saw the young woman in a wheelchair approach the arena. Frank rose from his reserved chair and quickly walked to the fence. "Emily," he said loudly, "there's still time to quit. Nobody will judge you for it." Emily stopped and turned to face him. There was a serenity in her eyes he had never seen before. "Mr. Thompson, I've spent 5 years preparing for this moment. 5 years thinking, studying, understanding. I didn't come this far to quit now. But girl, please," she interrupted softly, "trust me, as I'm going to trust him." Emily headed to the center of the arena, where she stopped her wheelchair. The crowd watched in absolute silence, not knowing what to expect. Some whispered prayers, others shook their heads in disbelief. Lightning was led to the chute, but his posture was different. He didn't show the violent agitation of previous days. He walked with measured steps, as if he too knew that this moment was special. "Emily Walker," announced Mark with a trembling voice, 17 years old, from Pine Ridge, will try to ride. Lightning without using a saddle. The crowd exploded in murmurs of incredulity. Frank gripped the fence so tightly that his fingers turned white. Emily approached the chute slowly. Lightning observed her through the wooden slats, his large dark eyes reflecting a calmness that contrasted with his fearsome reputation. "Hi, old fellow," she said, extending her hand to touch the animal's muzzle. "It's time." Lightning lowered his head and allowed her to caress him. It was a gesture of voluntary submission that made several people in the audience let out exclamations of surprise. With careful but determined movements, Emily supported herself on her arms and, with surprising strength for someone in her condition, lifted herself from the wheelchair. For a moment she balanced herself, supported on the chute fence, gathering strength for what was to come. Then, with an agility that left everyone open-mouthed, she mounted Lightning. The horse didn't become agitated. He didn't try to throw her. He remained motionless, as if waiting for a signal that only the two of them understood. Emily adjusted herself on the animal's back, found her point of balance, and nodded to the gate operator. "I'm ready," she said with a firm voice. The gate opened with a crash that echoed throughout the ranch, and at that moment something extraordinary happened, something that would forever change the history of Victory Ranch and the lives of all who were present that day. The gate opened with a crash. That echoed throughout Victory Ranch, but what happened next defied everything the 500 people present in the bleachers expected to see. Lightning didn't explode out of the chute like a tornado of fury. Instead, he took a few slow, measured steps to the center of the arena, as if walking in a procession. Emily remained mounted, her hands resting gently on the horse's mane, not forcing, not trying to control him. It was as if the two were executing a dance choreographed long ago, a choreography of the soul that dispensed with rehearsals. The silence in the arena was sepulchral. Not even the street vendors dared to speak. Everyone watched, hypnotized, this scene that seemed to have come from a dream or from a nightmare transformed into hope. "My God," murmured Martha, who had discreetly arrived and positioned herself next to her husband at the fence. "What's happening there?" Frank couldn't answer. His hands trembled as he gripped the wooden slats, his eyes fixed on the young woman riding the horse that had tormented his nightmares for 5 years. Lightning stopped in the center of the arena. Emily leaned slightly forward and whispered something in his ear. What she said nobody heard, but the effect was immediate. The horse lowered his head in a gesture that seemed almost human in its reverence. 8 seconds! Someone shouted from the audience. "She's already completed 8 seconds!" But Emily didn't dismount. She remained on Lightning, who continued motionless, as if both knew that this moment transcended any stopwatch or competition rule. It was then that something unexpected happened. Emily began to speak, her voice clear and strong enough to be heard throughout the arena. "My name is Emily Walker," she said, "and 5 years ago, my cousin Jason came to this ranch to participate in a competition like this one." A murmur ran through the crowd. Frank felt his legs tremble. "Jason was 17, the same age I am now," continued Emily, her voice gaining strength. "He was brave, determined, full of dreams. He wanted to prove he was man enough to tame Lightning." Lightning, as if understanding every word, raised his head and looked directly at Frank. There was something in his eyes that the rancher recognized for the first time. Regret. "That day I was here," said Emily, her voice now laden with emotion. "I saw everything happen. I saw when my cousin was thrown. I saw when he didn't get up again. I saw when his life changed forever." Tears began to roll down the faces of several people in the audience. Martha was openly crying, with her hands over her chest. "For 5 years I carried anger in my heart," continued Emily. "Anger at this horse, anger at this ranch, anger at everyone who allowed that to happen. But then I began to understand something very important." Emily caressed Lightning's mane with infinite affection. "I understood that Lightning isn't a ferocious animal. He's a wounded animal, wounded by guilt, by regret, by the impossibility of asking forgiveness for something he can't completely control. The horse emitted a low sound, almost like a moan, that echoed through the silent arena. "During these 5 years," said Emily, "my cousin Jason didn't just learn to live with his disability. He learned something much more important. He learned to forgive. He forgave Lightning, he forgave Mr. Thompson, he forgave life for the circumstances that brought him here." Frank fell to his knees in the packed dirt, sobbing like a child. 5 years of guilt, 5 years of nightmares, 5 years of regret exploded from his chest in a catharsis he didn't know he needed. "And today," said Emily, her voice now soft, "as a breeze, I came here not to win a competition or earn money. I came here to bring a message from Jason to Lightning." Emily leaned forward again and whispered in the horse's ear, but this time she spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "He forgives you. Jason forgives you, and wants you to stop punishing yourself." What happened next was something that no one in the arena would ever forget. Lightning began to tremble, not from anger or agitation, but from a deep emotion that seemed to come from his soul. Then, slowly, he lay down on the arena ground, with Emily still mounted. It was a gesture of total submission, of surrender, of release. The horse that had been considered untamable was lying on the ground, shedding tears that nobody knew horses could cry. Emily dismounted gently and knelt beside Lightning's head. She caressed his muzzle while whispering words of consolation that only he could hear. The crowd was completely silent, witnessing something that transcended entertainment or competition. It was a moment of healing, of forgiveness, of redemption that touched the soul of each person present. Frank rose slowly, wiped the tears from his face, and walked toward the center of the arena. When he got close, to Emily and Lightning he also knelt. "Emily," he said with a choked voice, I have no words for what I did to your cousin, for what I allowed to happen." "You don't need to ask forgiveness," interrupted Emily softly. "You were also wounded, Mr. Thompson. We were all wounded. But today, in this moment, we can begin to heal." Lightning raised his head and looked at Frank. For the first time in 5 years, there was no distrust or tension in that gaze. There was only peace. Frank extended his hesitant hand and touched the horse's muzzle. Lightning didn't back away. On the contrary, he rested his head on the man's hand, like a dog seeking affection. It was then that the crowd exploded in applause. They weren't applause of victory or conquest, but applause of pure emotion, of recognition that they had witnessed something extraordinary, something that would change their lives forever. Emily looked at the bleachers, where people were crying, applauding, and hugging each other. Then she looked at Lightning, who was now standing again, calm and serene as she had never seen him. "Thank you," she said softly to the horse. "Thank you for allowing me to bring the message." Lightning inclined his head, as if he were also thanking her. And in that moment, Emily knew that her mission had been fulfilled. The weight she had carried for 5 years had finally been lifted from her shoulders, and she could feel the presence of Jason smiling somewhere, finally at peace. 3. Months had passed since the day that became known throughout the region as the Miracle of Victory Ranch. The story of Emily and Lightning had spread far beyond the borders of Montana, reaching national newspapers, television programs, and even international documentaries about the connection between humans and animals. But for the protagonists of that extraordinary story, the real transformation was happening day by day, in the small changes that shape a new life. Frank woke up that June morning with something he hadn't felt in years: peace of mind. He walked to the window of the main house and observed the scene that had become familiar in the last few months. Emily was in the enclosure with Lightning, no longer talking to him through the bars, but walking freely by his side, sometimes mounted, sometimes pushing her wheelchair while the horse accompanied her like a faithful dog. "She's here every day," commented Martha, appearing beside her husband with 2 mugs of coffee. "Since that day, not one passes without her visiting." "Lightning, and he waits for her," observed Frank, accepting the coffee with a smile. "Yesterday, when she arrived late because of the rain, The poor thing was restless all morning, looking toward the ranch entrance. The relationship between Emily and Frank's family had evolved naturally. The rancher, who initially saw in her only a painful reminder of the past, now considered her like a daughter. He had even formally offered for her to come live at the ranch, but Emily preferred to maintain her independence, visiting every day and helping with Lightning's care. "Frank," said Martha, her voice carrying an affectionate curiosity, You asked her about her plans for the future, about college, career." Frank smiled. "Yes, I have. She wants to study veterinary medicine, specialize in animal behavior. Said she wants to help other animals that are wounded in the soul, as she calls it. And you're going to help with the costs?" "It's all arranged," replied Frank with pride. "I created a scholarship fund for her. It's the least I can do." Outside, Emily had mounted Lightning, and the two were walking slowly around the property. The horse, which before was a symbol of uncontrollable fury, now demonstrated a gentleness. That impressed all visitors who came to know the story. "You know, old fellow," said Emily, caressing the animal's mane, "today makes exactly 3 months since that day, and I have a surprise for you." Lightning perked up his ears, as if understanding that something special was about to happen. Emily directed the horse toward the ranch entrance, where a blue pickup truck was parked. When they got close, the passenger door opened, and a young man in a wheelchair descended from the vehicle with the help of a ramp. "Jason!" exclaimed Emily, quickly dismounting and running to hug her cousin. Jason Walker, now 22, had developed impressive strength in the upper part of his body. His eyes shone with the same determination that Emily had demonstrated 3 months before, but there was in them a serenity that spoke of acceptance and growth. "Hi, cousin," he said, returning the hug with "So strength. I missed you, and him too." The two cousins turned to look at Lightning, who had stopped a few meters away. The horse observed them intensely, as if processing Jason's presence. "Does he remember me?" asked Jason, his voice carrying only curiosity, without fear or resentment. "Let's find out," replied Emily, pushing his wheelchair toward the horse. When Jason approached, Lightning took a few hesitant steps. Then slowly he lowered his head to the level of the wheelchair, allowing the young man to touch his muzzle. "Hi, my old warrior," said Jason softly. "Long time no see, huh?" The horse closed his eyes and rested his head on Jason's shoulder, in a gesture of surrender and request for forgiveness that made Emily wipe away tears of emotion. "It's all right," whispered Jason, caressing the animal's neck. "All is forgiven. All is at peace." Frank and Martha, who had observed the scene from the house porch, approached respectfully. "Jason," said Frank, his voice trembling slightly, "I don't know if I have the right to ask, but—" "You're already forgiven, Mr. Thompson," interrupted the young man with a genuine smile. "Everything has been forgiven a long time ago. Life is this: learning, falling, getting up, forgiving, and moving forward." The rancher extended his hand, which was promptly shaken by Jason. It was a handshake that sealed not only the peace between them, but the beginning of a friendship that would last a lifetime. In the weeks that followed, Jason became a regular visitor to the ranch. He was studying psychology and developing research on animal-assisted therapy. Lightning had become his main partner in this work, helping other people with disabilities overcome traumas and develop confidence. "It's amazing," Jason would say to Emily on a sunny afternoon, as they watched Lightning gently interacting with an autistic child who had been brought for a therapy session. "He seems to know exactly what each person needs." "He learned from pain," replied Emily philosophically, "and those who learn from pain develop a special sensitivity to help others who are suffering." The tournament that had been planned as a demonstration of strength had transformed into something much greater. Victory Ranch had become a reference center for equine therapy, receiving visitors from all over the country who came seeking emotional healing through contact with animals. Frank, who before took pride in the fame of having the wildest horse in the state, now took pride in having transformed his property into a place of hope and healing. "You know, Emily," he said one morning, as they watched Jason conducting a therapy session, "I thought that tournament would be the highlight of my career as a rancher. I thought it would be my moment of glory." "And it was," replied Emily with a smile, "just not in the way you expected." "That's true," agreed Frank. "Sometimes our true glory comes when we stop trying to impress others and start helping them." The sun was setting over Victory Ranch, painting the sky in golden hues that reflected the peace that had settled in that place. Lightning grazed peacefully near the house, no longer isolated in a special enclosure, but free to walk around the property like any other animal. Emily pushed her wheelchair to him and rested her hand on his neck. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you for teaching me that true strength isn't in dominating, but in forgiving. It's not in winning, but in healing." Lightning raised his head and looked toward the horizon, where the first stars were beginning to appear. There was in his eyes a peace that spoke of mission accomplished, of healed pains, of souls that had found their way to the light. And that night, for the first time in 5 years, everyone at Victory Ranch would sleep the deep and restorative sleep of those who finally found peace. The story of Emily, Jason, and Lightning became legend throughout the Bear Valley region. But for those who lived it, it was much more than a legend. It was a lesson about the transformative power of forgiveness, compassion, and the human capacity to find light, even in the darkest situations. And Lightning, the horse that had once been a symbol of untamable fury, became a symbol of hope, proving that even the most